Hello and welcome to everyone watching this program, whether on Facebook or on YouTube. May I encourage everyone to invite your friends over for a watch party, if you're on Facebook, that is, and also to follow, not just to watch, but also to follow on both the YouTube channel and on the Facebook pages this series of programs that is happening. Um, to start with, I would like to introduce Vishal Mangalwadi, who is in a way the real host of this program. Vishal is an Indian by origin and nationality, but lives at present in the United States, stuck there because of the coronavirus pandemic, lockdown, whatever it's called, stay in place, as they say in the United States. He's a philosopher by training, but by calling is a public intellectual. And of course, he's written books on philosophy, as you would expect, but he's also written works of biography, of history, of social analysis, of politics, and so on. 21 books, and the 22nd on its way. And his books have been translated into 15 languages, 6 European languages, 6 Indian languages, and 3 languages from the Far East, that is Mandarin, Korean, and Indonesian Bahasa. So may I invite Vishal, please, to say a few words about this program, the whole background to it, and so on. Vishal.
Thank you, Prabhu. Professor Guptara, for 15 years, he worked leading think tanks for a bank, bringing together expertise for the leadership development in the bank and also outside. So we are very honored and blessed to have him moderating several of these lectures. He's helping us to organize all of the lectures, though he appears once in a while as the host and moderator. This is an element in an education revolution that I call the third education revolution, as the education system that began with the Protestant Reformation exactly 500 years ago, 1520, when Martin Luther wrote his first letter applying the priesthood of all believers to the issue of education. That whole revolution has fallen apart, and it is now the responsibility for the church to retake this mandate of discipling nation by educating every child. But to do that, we need all the intellectual resources that are available in the body of Christ globally. And this program is addressing issues. Coronavirus is the backdrop, but today we are looking at the social media, its power, because just as Luther and the other reformers used the print media, the need for the 21st century campaign to disciple nations requires us to understand and master social media, and that's sort of what we're discussing today. Do please invite others to join us. And none of us are being paid anything to do any of this. We haven't asked any foundation or institution to finance it, but we are grateful for your support, donations, which you can pay either in the US at revelationmovement.com or in Germany with Truth and Transformation in the organization. Thank you. And back to you, Prabhu.
Though I should say we're not discussing the social media today, we're discussing the public media, but the social media we will discuss the next time around, which is on the 4th of August. But today we have 3 speakers, Julia Bicknell, Chief Emeka Izeze, and Dr. Paul Marshall. Julia worked for more than 30 years for the BBC World Service, and in various capacities as a producer, as a reporter, as a stringer, as a trainer, And during the course of these 30 odd years, she also lived a year in Pakistan and Afghanistan, reporting from there and so on. And of course, she was involved with Vietnam for over 6 months when she lived there and did training there and was helping what was called Voice of Vietnam, which was a BBC project and so on. So we have an extremely experienced radio personality with us today. I should also say that my career in the Western media started, or at least was given a very big boost, because Julia kindly invited me to present programs for her on the BBC World Service. And so it's a particular pleasure to welcome you, Julia, on my program, as it were. We have also Chief Emeka Izeze. Chief Izeze is the chairman and the managing editor of the largest group of newspapers in Nigeria. So we have the print media represented. And we also have Dr. Paul Marshall, who is neither a professional radio man nor a professional print man, but a scholar and an academic, and is being, in addition to the things you will see about him on the screen, also a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute on the east coast of the USA, as well as far away as Indonesia, senior fellow of the Lemena Institute in Indonesia, and also adjunct professor faculty at the State Islamic University in Jakarta. So you can see we've got a very distinguished panel of speakers. You can see they represent different aspects of the public media, and it'll be lovely to hear them speak. So I should just quickly explain what we're doing in the program today. First, there'll be a discussion and interview, as it were, with each of the three of our panelists. And then the four of us, the three panelists and myself, will discuss briefly some aspects of what we've talked about. And I will then start picking up questions that you from the audience can feed in via both YouTube and Facebook. And these questions will be picked up by our colleague, Andreas Wieland, and his team, and then will be fed to me so that I can pick up those questions that seem to be appropriate at that point in the discussion to enrich the discussion. If by chance you don't feel like sending in questions via either Facebook or YouTube, and you prefer to email them in, you're welcome to do that. And the email to which the questions should be sent is info, short for information, info at truth and transformation, that's one word, truth and transformation.org. O-R-G. So, Julia, may I quickly turn to you, if you don't mind, and pop my first question across to you, which is, how responsible do you think the media have been in reporting this whole coronavirus, COVID, pandemic, lockdown business over these few months?
Well, if you take that, the public media, certainly as far as the Western media go, two of our main functions are to speak truth to power and also to hold our governments to account. And by the way, I should just add before I go any further, of course, I left the BBC nearly 8 years ago, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the BBC at all here. I'm just speaking as a professional journalist who's consumed more news, and I'm already a news junkie, than ever before in the time of this crisis. But anyway, coming back to speaking truth to power and holding our governments to account, you've got to remember that the public media, by and large, have also been working from home during lockdown. So, for instance, I was hearing somebody very senior in one of the daily newspapers here in the UK say that actually it's quite amazing that they've all carried on producing and broadcasting and everything else. I've heard funny stories about, people broadcasting with blankets over their head in their bedrooms and under the cupboard under the stairs. So if you consider, first of all, the responsibility, secondly, the conditions that many of my colleagues have been working in, I think they've actually done quite a good job. Of course, everyone, I'm predominantly speaking from my consumption of the media here in the UK. But yes, as they often say, the science has changed a lot. It's actually evolved an awful lot. But I want to give you one example of holding the government to account, and that's the story of what happened to our Prime Minister Boris Johnson's chief advisor, a man called Dominic Cummings. And if you probably are aware that what happened was we in the UK were given a very, very strict lockdown on the 23rd of March, and we weren't even allowed to visit our family or anything. And particularly a lot of NHS workers were asked to not even see their family. People were paying to stay in hotels so they wouldn't risk their family's health. And in the middle of all that, Dominic Cummings drove 260 miles from London to his parents' house. Now, he argued that he needed to do that. This was absolutely essential because he needed to have his parents help him and his wife, who were both suffering from coronavirus at the time, to look after their 4-year-old son. But of course, this was all secret. And basically what happened here in the UK, 2 newspapers, one a tabloid called The Mirror, and one The Guardian, which is would be well known as essentially critical of the government, independently, without knowing each other, had a source that came to each of them respectively and said, we believe that we've seen Dominic Cummings at his parents' house, where he technically, we think, according to the government's guidelines, should not be. And what actually happened between those 2 media, who normally would not collaborate at all, they actually did. They sort of shared intelligence ahead of publication in order to actually, what we say in the journalistic trade, stand up the story, because each one of them had one report. And the journalistic practice is you don't just go on one report in case you get it wrong. So these 2 newspapers, who are not natural collaborators at all, behind the scenes, they checked with each other and they agreed that what made sense to cover this important story, they would actually work together. And so you saw these strange headlines saying The Guardian and the media and the Mirror in a collaborative, have collaborated together. And so for me, that was quite an important sign that journalists were willing to put aside their rivalries, their, who's going to get this story out to the waiting world, to actually bring out truth, because either of them could have been wrong, but together they worked out they were actually right. So for me, that was a very positive thing to come out of a new way, maybe, that the public media might actually be working together out of this crisis. Prabhu, I can't hear you.
Oh.
There you go. I've got you now.
Yes, okay. To people who are not familiar with the UK media scene, it may not be so obvious that these 2 newspapers come from different sides of the political spectrum. So the Daily Mail is considered very much to the right.
Daily Mirror, the Mirror.
Daily Mirror is considered very much to the right, and the Guardian is considered very much to the left. So that is another aspect of the collaboration, which was interesting and strange. Now, Julia, this is a striking example. Do you think that is a representative example, or do you think that is an exception?
I think that was possibly an exception, but I think what it proved was that needs must. And in a crisis, maybe people are going to start working in new ways. Of course, again, you've also got to remember at that time Parliament wasn't sitting. So as we say, media journalism is the 4th estate, the 3rd one being our Parliament. So you've got the executive, the judiciary, the Parliament. And I think that's an important thing, that in a time of the fact that the government wasn't being challenged by the opposition, the political party, the media, the 4th estate, was sort of stepping in to hold the government to account. Whether that will be a way forward, I don't know. But the fact that it's happened is interesting.
Now, to the extent that it was representative or perhaps special, generally speaking, would you agree that the media have broadly been responsible? And if so, what factors do you think have enabled the media in the UK to be as responsible as they have been? considering that not media in all countries are, generally speaking, responsible. So what factors have enabled the UK media to be responsible to the extent that they have?
Well, I think the thing with public media is there's been, up until coronavirus, there's been a lot of talk about, mainstream media are being left behind, people not coming to them in the way that my parents' generation would, ritually sit down in front of the evening news. All these patterns of consumption, particularly amongst young people, are really changing a lot. But I think what has come out, I heard actually that The Guardian, again, the same newspaper, the number of people consuming their website content absolutely went off the scale as coronavirus was unfolding. They said they didn't believe they could get any more readers than they had the morning of Donald Trump's election, and this completely beat it hands down. And I think what they were saying was, in a time of crisis, people want to come to trusted media, trusted sources. And actually, that everybody I've heard speaking on this said it was very encouraging. People were turning to places like the BBC, places like Channel 4 News, some of the major media, traditional media, that really carry out rigorous process to get their news. And part of that also is, and this is something that people do point up, those organisations like the BBC, like the print media, they are actually regulated by a body here in the UK, so that if they they can be challenged. They can be challenged if they are reporting inaccurately or if they're exaggerating or whatever. And that's not the case with social media. That's not the case necessarily with other sources, with online websites that might have all sorts of information for good or ill. And so I think people were realizing they wanted to know what had really been checked out properly. And so they came back to the public media.
Thank you, Julia. So you pointed out that the media in the UK, these media that have grown in popularity, partly because they are trusted. And the reason, of course, they are trusted is because there is a rigorous process that each of these media channels have in place to ensure that what they put out is authentic, reliable, as far as possible, comprehensive, and so on. And of course, to the degree that they depart from straight, narrow road, there are regulators in place who will either themselves challenge them, or to whom you, as a member of the public or as an offended party, can go, so that these regulators can then tick you off and knock you on the knuckles and fine you and whatever else they can do. These are obviously very important things, as indeed is training, because without the training, there will not be the rigorous process in place. And you have been, of course, a very important part of making sure that the training is right for journalists so that they can go through the rigorous process by which the stories that are put out and the programs that are put on have this kind of trustability, which is very important. May I now turn, if I may, to Chief Izeze. I think we can see you all right and possibly hear you. Emeka, can I start the same question with you, if you don't mind? How responsible do you think that the print media have been in Nigeria, of course, in Africa as a whole, perhaps in the world, whatever ambit you want to take, whatever scope you want to take in terms of answering the question, how responsible do you think print media have been?
Well, I think, let me just say that the only title chief I ever got was being editor-in-chief. So I'm not a traditional chief, I'm just an editor-in-chief. I was actually, until recently, managing director, editor of the newspaper you mentioned. I'm only now a director of the newspaper, among other things. And let me say that the media was unprepared for the advent of COVID-19. COVID-19 caught the media by surprise, as it caught virtually everybody. It shouldn't catch the media by surprise. In that early stages, you could see very tentative steps being taken by the media. You could see some not believing that this is serious.
We can't hear you clearly now.
Anything they had seen before. And a few others.
We can't hear what you're saying, Emeka. I'm sorry, the technology is not enabling us to work.
Saying, is it any better now? Wow.
I think that has gone off. So I will turn, if I may, to Paul at the moment. There. Are you back?
I am.
Okay,
here.
good.
I don't know if you are hearing me.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, so I was saying that at the initial stage, the media was tentative in responding to COVID-19. I was also saying that the media then started doing a catch-up with COVID-19 as it spread out of Wuhan into other parts of China, parts of Asia.
No, I'm sorry. This is really not working.
And
I'm sorry. This is really not working. Yeah.
There was even a feeling of a certain minimization of the impact of this that made.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We don't have.
Can you hear me without video? Wow. I don't know.
We can hear you a bit.
Yeah, I can. I'm also hearing gargling noise from your end, so I think it's a connection. But I don't know if you can hear me without video.
Yes, we can hear you now. Carry on.
Okay, so I think that the media, in doing catch-up, had left a certain lacuna that then ensured that the populace, the public generally across the world, wasn't as prepared and as equipped to cope with COVID-19 as it should have been. And I also think that the media wasn't quite prepared for the ramifications that COVID-19 was bringing to life generally. By the time the media caught on with it, what we had was also a division, as had always been in the media. You were talking of the British press a moment ago, and talking of those to the left, and talking of those to the right. By the way, the Mirror and the Guardian are both to the left. And is that cleavage that we started seeing. Some to the right didn't quite believe that this is a serious issue, particularly in certain countries. And others to the left thought that they actually became hysterical at some point. Either way, the media failed at those initial stages. But then the media started catching on because everything we know about COVID now, everything we hear about what the authorities are doing, we pick up from the media. And without having the media playing catch on and abandoning part of the politics of media operations across the world, most of them had to abandon that, at least momentarily. Without doing that, we will not have gained as much as we have gained from the media. To that extent, I think their responsibility in this matter was conditioned by the surprise element of COVID-19. I don't know if it should have been so. I don't know what I would have done if I were an editor of a newspaper or a broadcast station when something is happening in Wuhan, China. I don't know what I would have done in Africa that they didn't do. So it's very easy to look back. Hindsight gives you a certain strength. But at that moment, they were operating on the spur of the moment. And the spur of the moment meant that the media was responding to what was coming to it very fast. I think what I have learned in this is that we in the media need a lot more preparation. So we were not prepared for a pandemic at all. We were not even prepared for an epidemic that will affect certain parts of the world. From what I can see, those affected simply ignored, those not affected ignored those that are affected. And it then became localized. It shouldn't be. And I think that we need a lot more preparation in that regard.
The question is that, yes, the question is, World Health Organization, for example, and many other international bodies have been warning us for a very long time that a new pandemic was going to hit us at some point, just as the World Meteorological Association organization and other associations have been warning us that we are in for some major earthquakes and other such disasters for some time. But of course, the problem is that human beings, being human beings, don't like to listen to warnings. And as we don't like to listen to warnings, we don't prepare. And it's not just that we don't like to listen, it's also that there are things that occupy our time and attention, are things that are urgent. And so, for those reasons as well, we tend not to prepare ourselves for the things that we know are going to come at some point. But one of the things you're pointing out is that the factor that is certainly responsible for the degree to which the press were responsible is freedom. So if you don't have a free press, then of course it's not possible for the press to be responsible. And the other aspect which you've not touched on, but which I would like you to comment on, is finance. So in the UK, the BBC is financed by public subscription, by a tax that is, as it were, paid by everybody at present in the UK. But when it comes to newspapers, of course, you have mainly two sources of income: advertisements and subscriptions.
That's circulation. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how is that playing out in this time of crisis, COVID, for you in Nigeria, both the advertisements and the subscriptions?
It's been very, very tough for the media, both in Nigeria, across Africa, from all what I hear, and also what I read, even in places like the United States. Media houses are shutting down, even in the United States. Media houses are asking for stimulus from government to be able to survive. And I think, to the best of my knowledge, recollection, I think they have already started considering some stimulus for them for some of the media, some of the newspapers, and in the United States. Because everybody was at home, because people were working from home, because schools were not opened, because factories, companies were not operational, nobody was advertising. There was no need to advertise to anybody, because in any case, the products and the services that you're advertising are not needed at that point in time. And in many places, it's still the case today. So the newspaper didn't sell very much. And they also didn't get advertising. The broadcast media didn't get a lot of advertising, still are not getting as much as they were getting before, because the economies across the world are not all fully opened evenly. Until that happens, the media is going to continue to suffer. And I think that this will even have its own implication for media freedom in parts of Africa.
Well, not just in
parts of the third world.
Yeah. Yes, not just in Africa, of course, but even in places like the United States. If governments start giving a subsidy to the media, then of course they become dependent on the media. The media become dependent on the subsidy, and of course it means that the media will tend not to want to challenge the government quite as much over time. So this business of depending on government subsidies, of course, is quite dangerous. But if I may, since we're discussing the United States, if I may turn to Dr. Paul Marshall. Paul, how do you see the situation from the United States? And of course, since you have experience also of Indonesia and the Far East, maybe you can bring in something from that too. How do you see whether the media have been responsible, or the degree to which media have been responsible in relation to this whole COVID and coronavirus crisis?
Oh, thank you very much, Prabhu. Of course, there are hundreds, thousands of media outlets, and they vary in their responsibility. But as a generalization in the US, I would say the media have not been responsible. I don't cover the Indonesian media as much, but those I do, I would say they've done a better job of covering what happens in Indonesia. The problems in the US are now the media and everything else is just so politicized, so that any coverage of COVID-19 has this political undertow. So, for example, Donald Trump suggested, the president suggested several months ago that hydrochloroquine might be, a good thing to use against the virus. And since then, you will find right-wing media highlighting any study which shows it might be effective, and left-wing media showing any study that it might not be. Why is the effectiveness of a drug? Surely we can wait till the tests, but they are so the politicization of coverage is one major problem. I think a second one is a tendency to go for the most frightening scenario. If a study says the deaths may be 125,000, hey, if a study says could be 500,000, then there'll be major coverage of that. And from what I can see of the studies, it could be anything. So there's a tendency to go with the most frightening scenario. And
sorry, if I may jump in, Paul, and say both the things that you've mentioned, both the politicization and the fact that media tend to go for what is most sensational are related, are they not, to two things. One is the question of media ownership, who owns the media, and to the question of the race to get the biggest readership figures you can. Are these not both diseases that need to be addressed if we are going to get more responsible media?
Yes, exactly so. It isn't as if the media just politicized itself out of the blue. The population in the US is now highly politicized. So if you want to drive up your readership or your viewership, then you become more ideological. If you are trying to be as much as you can balanced, you're losing out on the zealots, and a high proportion of the population now are zealots. There's one other factor too. This is not all the sort of fault of reporters or owners. There is fault out there, but there's something basic about the nature of the media, which tends to go for the sensational. If I can put it simply, what we call news can be something which is important, like the virus, millions are stricken, hundreds of thousands are dead. That's an important thing. There are things which are more locally important to us. The weather forecast. Is there going to be a parade in the town? Things like this. Not worldwide significant, but things we want to know about. And the third one, and this is where the danger comes in, is the unusual. If 50,000 airplane flights take off, fly, land safely, it's not news. If one crashes, it's news. If 1 million people are safe, not news. If a person is murdered, it's news. This isn't a criticism of the news media. It's the nature of the case. Who wants to read about a plane which went about its business as usual? But if it crashes, we wanted to know, what was the danger? Did we know anybody on that plane? So one feature of the media is that it highlights the unusual, the different, the strange. So that if we look at the world too much through the media, if we let it mediate between the world and us, we will get a distorted picture, because we're seeing much more the unusual, the different, the strange. And I'm not sure the media can do anything about that, because as we say, who wants to read about things which aren't problems?
Yes, we could say blessed are they who don't have to read the newspaper or watch television or keep up with the social media. But there is a factor underneath that, isn't it? And that is media ownership. One of the reasons why we've got a politicized media is not just that people want to know about the unusual or the scandalous or whatever else, but it is because the media have been forced by their owners to push out reporters who are from a different political point of view or from a more neutral point of view, so that the newspapers or media, television channels, and so on have themselves gradually become more ideologically committed as a result of their ownership. So the question that I have is the quest for a more responsible media not intimately tied with legislation which bans the ownership of media by politically oriented people, or forces media to be owned by people who have, by definition, membership of different political parties? So you can only sell, let's take the Wall Street Journal or let's take Fox TV. The owners must, by law, be 50% Democratic Party and 50% the Republican Party. If you had legislation like that, that would immediately mean that you had much more neutrality, whether it's Fox TV or whether it's Wall Street Journal or whatever it is, New York Times or whatever it is. You wouldn't have the kind of criticism that you have at the moment of politically committed media if the ownership of media was much more balanced.
Well, I don't think the type of legislation you mentioned would work. How do you do that? And
well, you do it by putting it through Parliament in the normal way.
I
mean, there is only one way for the law to exist, and that is it goes through Parliament or it goes through the House.
But most senior people in media usually don't join political parties.
No, I'm talking of the ownership. No, I'm talking of the ownership.
No, but a similar thing. What do you do? A Democrat or Republican? What if someone just says, "Oh, I just resigned from the Democratic Party"? That structure wouldn't work. It's not necessarily party identification. It's your political views, and you can have fights. Say in the New York Times, in the firing of the opinion page editor a while ago. This was not a fight between the left and the right. It was a fight between the left and the very left. So it's very hard to deal with ownership. One thing we need to do, and here I'm talking about consumers of media, is to realize that there is a structural bias. Again, if all the reporters and all the owners were perfect, it would nevertheless be true that the media highlights the unusual, the worrying. So we need to realize that the world is not the way we usually see through the media. Take our own personal experience every day of what's happening much, much more seriously. Otherwise, we're always seeing through this glass darkly. And
the other thing we could do as consumers, of course, is to make sure that if we are ourselves left inclined, if I may put it that way, then we deliberately expose ourselves to right-wing media. Or if we are naturally right inclined, deliberately look for left-wing media to see what they're saying so that we can educate ourselves and see things from different points of view and not just have our own bias reinforced, which is what tends to happen quite often, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. And that's a very good suggestion. I think for us, we're sort of, I think everybody on this are major news consumers. So we do cover a range. It's harder for the average person, who doesn't read news for a living. Most of us read news for a living. Well, but still, to cover
you can devote 5 minutes to reading the headlines from a newspaper that you would not normally subscribe to, or even that you dislike. But may I bring in the other panelists at this point and ask if any of the others, that is Julia or Emeka, have any comments on what has been shared or discussed so far? Anything to add or anything to question or contradict?
I'd like to come in if that's okay. So I agree with what Paul has been saying, and also to some extent I think Emeka mentioned this, and that is a lot of people working in the media realise that the basic model is flawed, if not broken, because it is, especially in today's digital world, it's all about clickbait. Actually, you mentioned it, Prabhu, yourself, when you said, it's what's unusual and different. The problem with all of this is I actually get very frustrated because in an attempt to really verify and give accurate news, particularly from other countries, by the time you check it out properly, you check your two sources, a version of that truth has gone out in sometimes the national media of that country. And once that version is out there, that becomes the defining narrative. And especially if it's in any way might be sensational or controversial, the whole idea of people writing headlines for the clicks. And so there is a bit of a movement going on that I'm aware of, and it's actually called the Public Media Alliance. And it's saying that we need to really rethink the whole model of the way that we get our information on the web, on websites, via social media, etc. And the problem is how to do it and how to get it funded. That's the difficulty, because as someone said at the start, I think it was you, Emeka, when nobody is consuming, then the need for the advertising goes down. And if the advertising has been the typical model on digital, then if our advertising revenues are going down, that's not going to help anyone. So I think, yeah, those are a few thoughts, really. Yeah, let me leave it there.
Good. Emeka, do you want to come in with any particular comments or contributions?
Yes, I think that sometimes the role of ownership is overstated. My experience showed that ownership has absolutely no role whatsoever in what I did. But I also know that in some parts, okay, I'm putting the camera on, okay, and I think that
We
okay, I
can't
saw
see.
the camera. Yeah, what I think is that ownership has very little to do with the ideological inclination of the people running, of news managers in this age. And that's really what we should be talking about. That's what happened in New York Times. I'm not aware that anybody wrote any guideline that says if you are going to get this sort of thing done in New York Times, you'll be fired. And it came from the publisher or from the board. But the people running the newspaper have developed a culture, and that has not been dealt with. That a new culture is developed by the people managing media houses over time, and that culture is very difficult to shake off. So when you're talking of ownership, in a few instances, yes, and I don't need to go into some of them specifically, but mostly from my experience, it is not that the owner has any say in how you do it, is that you, as the manager, tend to believe that this is what we stand for, and then you begin to cultivate a new culture and then pass it down the line over time, and it becomes difficult to shake off. It started, incidentally, in my view, from the United Kingdom, when you have newspapers identified purely by their political inclination. The United States caught on this very recently. It was not always like this in America. But America is engaged in a culture war at the moment, and I think it's going to continue. But in the third world, you can have a newspaper owned by a political party, but everybody knows it's owned by a political party. Whereas the other newspapers have their own ways of reporting. So I think what we need to be looking at is why it is so easy for media managers, in many instances, not all, to develop a culture that become very difficult to shake off, and then influences the way issues are framed and stories are reported and news is disseminated. And it is an incredible experience that we're having. We're discussing it because of COVID-19. We could have been discussing it because there's going to be an election in any country, in India, in the UK, in Nigeria, in Africa, anywhere. It could have been the same story. But it is just that we live in a new age where information, they used to tell us that information is power. I don't even think that information is as powerful as it used to be anymore, because we who manage the media have somehow diffused the influence and the influence that information we impart tend to have. Right now, people get information and ask, where did you get it? You tell them the medium, and then immediately they tend to explain it because it's coming from one medium. So I think the media has a greater challenge to begin to re-examine its modus operandi and to say we can't continue this way, otherwise we're going to just keep running into trouble.
So we have obviously the issue of owners in some countries influencing what's happening and appointing news managers of their political inclination. And on the other hand, as you were saying, Emeka, we have countries or cases where we do have owners with a particular political inclination, but they're not trying to push that through the newspapers or media they own. Both situations exist. And therefore, insofar as any particular channel or newspaper is not, magazine or whatever, is not being objective, we have to look both at the ownership issues and we have to look at the issue of the people, the managers, as it were, of the media, the news managers and feature editors and so on. That, of course, adds another dimension to this whole issue of how responsible organizations are or have been. Can I just go back to Julia and say, and ask Julia, this business of training journalists to be objective, how difficult is it and how much time does it take in your experience? Do you get young people coming in who you find are very easy to train, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day? Or do you think it's a matter of a week, or do you think it's a matter of a lifetime? I mean, you know, what is your experience with all this?
I think it's becoming harder. I think it's becoming harder because in some ways the whole, as Paul said when he started, there are thousands and thousands of media outlets, and also there are thousands and thousands of sort of social media, and I think everyone thinks they can become a sort of an expert overnight, and they often don't know enough. They don't have the necessary background. So for me, I mean, when I joined the BBC, I trained, and this wasn't so much in journalism, but trained for 6 months completely full time, just training on different aspects of working in broadcasting, and that included editorial values and that kind of thing. And there's a very clear I haven't got it here, but there's a big clear handbook that says very clearly what you can do and what you can't do. And I would say, when you said, does it take a day or a week or a month? I think it takes years to become the kind of person that can really think through what are the editorial values that we're trying to portray. And sometimes they come up very dramatically. Sometimes, like I was in the World Service newsroom, I took a call, this was probably in my first year, during the Iran-Iraq war, which gives away roughly how long ago that was, someone threatening that if our correspondent in the region covering the war reported the loss of a particular battle at that time, if he was allowed to go on the air on the World Service and tell us what had happened, they would kill him. I mean, that was a very clear threat to the life of a journalist. And the BBC went ahead and broadcast, as it would say, had to broadcast the result, whether the man was going to get killed or not. Fortunately, he was not killed, but that's a very direct threat. So you sort of learn these values by going through these experiences. So what do we do in this type of situation? And I think a lot of it is changing. I mean, I was personally shocked just a couple of weeks ago when I heard that there are now people on the, I mean, I don't know if people around the world have heard this, Yes. Shall I stop there? Ah. Okay. On my sound, is that better? Is that better? As far as I know, it hasn't changed at all. Hang on. I'm going. Can I take the microphone off? Would that help? Does this help me without? That better? No. Sorry. Unplug it. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'll take the headphones off. I was saying, oh yes, that's right. So the other day I heard that there are now, there were a lot of opinion articles going into the digital media from fake journalists, accounts that had been created in order to look as if there were real journalists reporting stories with a slant towards a particular Gulf country, and these people didn't exist, and I was personally shocked at that. So there's a lot more clever things going on around the world to convince people of things that certain governments or certain bodies or certain groups, like all sorts of groups, want to achieve their objectives that didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. So I think it is becoming more difficult.
A gentleman from India, Binto John, who asks, who makes the point that I am not even sure people care for truth as much as for political gain. And of course, you could say this in relation to journalists, you could say this in relation to media owners, you could say this in relation to consumers. What do you feel about this statement that many people around the world today are not really interested in truth, they're interested in political gain? Maybe Paul, you want to come in at this point? Can't hear you.
I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot of truth in that. That again, I'm in the context in the United States. Obviously, there are people still interested in truth, but that politicization is there in terms of mainly in the selection of stories. What is it you're going to cover? And as we said earlier, a major reason for why this happens is that the audience itself is not that interested in truth. It's, I have a view of the world, I want to have it reinforced. Give me a story, give me a fact which reinforces it. So yeah, it's the politicization of the readership, the viewership, as well as the media itself.
So this, of course, is a historic turn, if you don't mind my putting it that way. The function of the media was to challenge people, both with the news they brought, because the news itself can be challenging, because it can shatter your preconceptions about a particular part of the world, or about a particular individual, or a particular group. And of course, specifically when the media tries to hold a government to account or speak truth to power, it is doing exactly the opposite of enabling political gain on the part of people who hold political power. So if we now have a population that's turned away from wanting to know the truth, but a population that's more interested simply in underlining and reinforcing its own prejudices or its own views, what do you think? Do you think there's really any role for the media left? Because if all you want is reinforcement of your own views, why would you bother to pay somebody to reinforce your views? I mean, you have your views, you have your views.
Okay, I think it can be combated that not in the first place through the media, but through questions of education and also getting people to discuss with those who are different from them or different from us, and actually realize the people who disagree with you are not necessarily evil and not necessarily idiots, but actually have a case to make. So encouraging that sort of dialogue is important. And there are media outlets now springing up whose purpose is precisely to do that. To get a website, get something on YouTube where you have two people of different views who have a discussion of that. Very famous example here is Robert George, professor at Princeton, described by the New York Times as probably the most influential conservative intellectual in the United States. And one of his best friends, Cornel West, African-American professor, very left-wing, who teaches at Harvard. And they regularly get together at conferences and put out podcasts where they talk to each other and discuss and disagree. So I think efforts like this to meet with the people we think of as the other are very important, and to sort of break down this obsession. We need to get out of our boxes.
Emeka, you were going to come in and say something earlier, I think. Can't hear you, you're muted. Ah, good.
Yes, I think the media had a role in the present situation, if nothing else, to redirect people to where we ought to be directing the public. I think that the public has not always been this divided. I think that the media itself has not always been this way. And I don't see this lasting forever. I think that this is transient. We look around the world, look around the kind of leaders we have in the world today, they are defining the way we live. And so the media is simply following. But the time is coming when we won't have this sort of leaders all over the world. And they will not, so the leaders we have will not define things this way. I think the media must keep faith and continue to push on the direction, the original concept for the media coming into being, which is, you're talking of truth. It's so relative now, and people turn truth into a relative object. So everybody has a truth to market. The people who are saying something else are the truth. The other side is bringing a truth. But so we cannot deal with the relativity of truth. Truth remains truth. How we're going to find it is a challenge, and I think the media should and can begin to recapture that same center stage again.
So you just said something very important, and that is everybody has a truth to market, to promote, to push to the public. How do you think this business can be counteracted in the medium or long term, Julia?
I think that exactly what you were saying. I mean, it's a whole range of things. I mean, I'm going to give you a very specific, practical thing. During the pandemic earlier on, I received a message from a WhatsApp group of some of my closest friends, and it was a story. It was a very positive story, and it was essentially out of Italy. A surgeon who had been impressed by the witness of a Catholic priest who had been caring for coronavirus patients in northern Italy. And he had actually cared for them, and then he had caught the coronavirus himself and very sadly had died. And this had apparently had a profound effect on this doctor. And so this was a lovely story, very positive, coming out of northern Italy, and it appeared on my phone on a WhatsApp group from one of my dear friends, and I was just about to retweet it, and then I thought, I'll just check this out. And actually 2 hours later I'd actually traced this story back, and I realized that it wasn't what it purported to be. It had actually been fabricated, apparently, this story. And I then phoned someone I knew in Italy, and I said, this is what I found out, the person who seems to have started this story. Do you know anything about it? Can you talk to your friends? And it was actually, I'm sorry to use the term, fake news. And so I just think that's such a simple thing we can all do. There is a little slogan, but I can't remember what it is offhand, which is don't forward anything that you cannot be sure of the truth of it. Now, that was a very simple example. And yes, it took a little while to dig out, it involved me going back through Facebook, just, tracking back in terms of dates that that posts had appeared. And I apologize for our clock chiming at this point. And so I just thought, isn't that significant that you just need to check everything that comes into your Facebook feed? You can't be sure. And I think that would be a really good discipline for all of us. I'm not saying we'd take 2 hours to track it back, but just, look online. Is this something that's circulating 9 months after it originally happened? I mean, I get sent things occasionally, and I know they're really out of date. But particularly, and I'm sorry to say, this can be true of people of faith, because I read this last week, a report for some journalists in Brazil saying people of faith often want to just forward something quite naively, I think. And so that would be my one example. Each of us has to be our own news editor, really.
Whether it's people who have faith or people who don't have faith in whatever, the point you're making is of course a very important one, but it means that you have to take the time, you have to have the responsibility, take the responsibility to actually check things out and do something about it. But of course, this is slightly diverting us from the topic of the media. Is it the case that we have more irresponsible reporting now from the media simply because the multiplicity of channels, and there isn't the training and the culture and so on, which in the old days you would have had, because everybody would have been properly trained by the BBC, even if he or she had then left to join ITV or go off to some independent channel. They were all properly trained. But now, of course, you don't need any training. Anybody can set himself or herself up as a broadcaster. Any group can go into broadcasting. Is the lack of training one important factor which explains why we have so much fake media around nowadays?
Yes, I mean there's a whole variety of reasons, and I think you're absolutely right. My definition of what do I mean by a trained journalist and someone else's definition, they can differ wildly. And as you said, the whole thing of citizen journalists. But on the other hand, also we've got to remember that, and you just caught me again with another clock chiming. The thing about it is that we shouldn't throw everything out, because obviously the fact that people do have mobile phones mean that we can capture what is really happening in the world in a way that people can now use that to challenge corruption, to show political malpractice, whatever, in a way that maybe 20 years ago nobody could actually prove things had happened. Now there might be someone there with a mobile phone who catches the politician, off guard, confiding in somebody that he's just been given a bribe or whatever it is. So I think we shouldn't say it's all terrible because there is such a multiplicity of media and anyone can do it. There have been some good things along the way as well.
Other comments from Paul? You haven't spoken for some time. Any particular thing you want to add at this point?
Not on this one, I think, except I agree with Julia. So, yeah.
Good. Emeka, anything to add at this point?
I think we covered some ground. If you have any issues you want us to discuss.
Okay. So we've been discussing various aspects of the public media in terms of how responsible they have been, and in terms of the factors that have caused them to be responsible to the degree they have. And we've looked at one or two suggestions, good ones or bad ones, regarding how we can encourage the media to be more responsible. We are, of course, talking about media in the free world, and we've always had the issue, or at least for a very long time, of media not from the free world. This is state propaganda machines. And do you feel these state propaganda machines are getting stronger or weaker in the current situation? Any views?
They're getting stronger. That a lot of authoritarian regimes are waking up to the fact that their propaganda has to be more subtle. The old ways of you just put out this lie out there doesn't work. So you start, Russia starts its own TV channel, and it imitates a regular TV channel. You have people coming on, you have people being interviewed with a very particular slant. Now, old media have some slant, but this is far more. It's far deeper. It's state subsidized. It's a more subtle, more winsome way of getting out your propaganda. China is doing something very similar, and one of the things we're discovering is that many Chinese reporters are in fact simply state functionaries, and but at some level they can even be spies, so that you're getting government operatives now masquerading as journalists, outlets masquerading as newspapers or TV channels, which are simply propaganda outlets, and they're getting more sophisticated, and it gets harder to see their slant. It's a very dangerous development.
Yeah. So for the consumer, confronted by, let's say, a particular country, I won't name any particular countries, but let's say from a particular country, basically state propaganda, are there any tests that you can suggest to a consumer listening to this television program or radio program or reading this newspaper or magazine? Are there any tests you can suggest by which a consumer can begin to distinguish between sheer propaganda, so to speak, and facts to the extent they may be there?
Who owns the outlet? A point you had made earlier. Who funds it? Is it operating in a setting where people are allowed to say what they think? If I go back to China, you're looking at Chinese news outlet. If a reporter says something critical of the government or critical of the senior members, you could argue with local ones, they're going to be removed. So the environment in which it operates, is it one which is free? If it isn't, then you cannot trust what comes out of there. So I would suggest those are at least a couple of tests one can use.
Or Emeka, to that?
Yes, I think there are tests that have to be followed, and one of them is that you look at the track record of the media organization. How has this organization performed in the past? It is very easy to make a mistake once or twice, but when something becomes regular, it becomes a culture, then it is very easy to know that this is the wrong place to get your information from. So you look at the culture, you look at the history, and you ask, how have they performed in the past? How did I rate their performance, the information I got off them? And I think that actually the challenge of doing media, if you permit me to use that term, the challenge of doing media now had never been greater than it has been, because there are just too many threats, and the threats are no longer coming only from the usual suspects, the propagandists in the state propagandists, spies operating as journalists in some countries, and people who never really studied journalism, who had no clue what news is all about, also churning out information and forcing people to consume them. Those are threats. But I think that the greater threat is to find that the media either had lost its way, or the media never really should be taken seriously in the first place. And a media organization that makes a mistake once and corrects it, you can say that this still remains credible. So getting information of them is fine. Permit me to just mention this same New York Times, with all its challenges and all its problems, sacking the opinion editor became a major news. That's because that's not in the manner of New York Times doing things. So we really have to start looking at the culture that they have developed. If it's a usual thing to get things wrong or get things slanted, then that is the wrong place to look at
Yes.
information from.
Any other tips from you, Julia, for consumers of media? How do you spot the difference between fake news and real news?
Well, we in the UK we have some organisations. Actually, we have one called Full Fact. We have another one, I think, called Fact Check. And there are some I know in the United States that have started up where actually cooperatives, sometimes of trained journalists, will actually decide that there is a value in checking out, whatever it might be, the government's track record on what, keeping its promises from one election to the next. It's that kind of thing. But yeah, and more journalists are being trained to investigate what they call data journalism. So, you can look out for networks of people who are checking out, financial companies. And, when you get a story about their performance, you actually can say, well, hang on a minute, this is just pure puff. This is putting a spin on some, positive thing about this company when actually they're really about to go bust or whatever it might be. So I think it's just for an ordinary consumer to have a bit of sort of intelligence and common sense around what they're reading. The other thing is to look out for emotional language, language that is manipulative, language that wants to make you think or respond in a certain way, language that is, a bit, manipulative. I think you can spot when some text is kind of trying to make you respond emotionally to it.
So what you're talking about, Julia, seems to be what the role of investigative journalism used to be.
Yeah, to some extent, yes.
And of course, these fact-checking organizations and so on that have come into being now are doing the job that investigative journalists used to do. And it's the decline of investigative journalism which has created the space for these fact-checking organizations to come into existence. And of course, it's very good that they're there. But can they make up for the lack of investigative journalism on the mainstream media?
Well, you see, okay, so when you say investigative journalism is declining, I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I think it's being done differently. I think, yes, as major media broadcasters don't necessarily have the money, the funding to allow people to just pursue one story for 3 months. What you're seeing, again, is collaborations. I mean, when you think about the Panama Papers, for instance, that was done by, a major media outlet in Germany with major media outlet in the UK, the US, and people were pooling because of the way that we can now, work across continents and across boundaries in a way we couldn't have done 10 years ago even. People are able to cross-check. They're able to share, massive data folders and things like that. So you can actually have I would argue, in some ways, investigative journalism is entering a new era of actually, being able to do really good stuff. The trouble is, it's expensive and it's time-consuming. So you need the funding again and the organisations that are willing to invest in it and spend that time and energy on it.
Good. Thank you. Any last points from any of you before we round up our discussion and go into the announcements and things that we need to make before we come to the end of our program?
Just one thing, a warning for the future on fake news. The possibility now of faking video. Martin Scorsese had that movie, The Irishman, and in the movie he had actors in their 70s and took them back to when they were in their 30s and slowly aged them. So it's now possible to have a video of a press conference which never took place. And you can see you'll be able to see yourself on YouTube doing things you never did. And this becomes a very worrying thing for the future.
And of course, the question is, we don't have the legislative framework yet for things like that. Because if there was an international legislative framework for things like that, then it would be, one, much more difficult to do it, and two, if you did do it, you'd be caught whichever country you were in doing it. and you would then be penalized, which would mean you would tend not to do it so much. But in the absence of any sanctions, in the absence of any system to deal with it, obviously it's an open playing field. So that is, of course, quite a worrying issue. Now, may I just thank all our panelists before I turn to Vishal for a word of talking with God before we conclude, and a few announcements and so on. So thanks very much to Julia for kindly joining us, and may I wish you the best also for your coaching program that you do for individuals and organizations. Thank you very much for that. And Emeka, thank you for your contributions all the way from Nigeria, in spite of the technical problems we have had. Thank you for persisting and for the points you've made. Very valuable. Thank you. And Paul from the US, thank you for making your contributions as well. And all the best for your work both in the US and in Indonesia.
Thank you.
May I ask Vishal now to just talk with God, chat with God about the sorts of things that we've been saying, and commit all of us, but also all of our listeners, to God's good care.
Well, thank you, the panelists, and thank you, Prabhu, for this very helpful conversation. The modern free press began in England with the Puritans, who paid for it with their blood. Many of them were persecuted, their noses cut, their ears cut, even throats cut. Now we have a situation where the president of a country says about the most educated, most resourceful, most influential media that this is fake news. Marvin Olasky, he republished in 2013 his 25-year-old book, The Prodigal Press, Confronting the Anti-Christian Bias of the Media. So we have a situation in the West where Christianity created the free press with that spirit of the prophet speaking truth to power. But now the press has what Olasky says, a tremendous anti-Christian bias, which has become anti-truth bias. So the president undermining the press, and people believing that, yes, press is untrustworthy. So in that context, to have this discussion of the people who are taking responsibility for making sure that God's will is done on earth, bring that to the area of news and news reporting. A journalist once again becoming a witness to the truth, even if he's not the eyewitness, he's investigating with eyewitness and giving people, coming across as a witness to the truth rather than someone who's spinning stories out of what actually happened. So that's the challenge, and thank you for stimulating us to consider this important topic. So let's pray. Father, we acknowledge that your body, your bride, has abandoned the media. It is a prodigal press. But we thank you for those who are in this media, seeking to return it to sanity, to truth, to nobility, to wisdom, to goodness and beauty. Thank you for what is being done, and thank you for stimulating us today through this very enlightening conversation. And we pray that you will raise up witnesses who will bear witness to the truth, not for money, not for fame, not for clicks, but because they really want to see your kingdom come, your will done on earth as it is in heaven. So we thank you and we offer ourselves to you to be your children, to be your servants in this sphere of journalism. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So it's my very pleasant duty to request you, the audience, to once again follow the program, both on Facebook and on YouTube. And if you do so, you will get the notice of the next program that's coming up, which will be on the 4th of August, when we will, in fact, be discussing social media. What has caused social media to become so toxic in parts? And to the degree it has become toxic, what can be done about reducing its toxicity, its unhelpful and perhaps aggressive, untrue attitudes? So do tune in on the 4th of August for a rather deep discussion about these kinds of topics. May I once again thank our speakers, and particularly Andreas Wieland and Finn, working away in the background for making this program possible. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been lovely to be here with you, and look forward to seeing you again on the 4th of August. Bye for now.